In the autumn of 1942, a United States Navy submarine surfaced in the South Pacific after an attack run that its crew believed had gone perfectly. The approach had been textbook. The firing solution was correct. The range was close enough that a miss was almost geometrically impossible. The torpedo had run straight and true. The crew had heard it hit, and the Japanese destroyer they had just attacked was still moving, still alive, completely undamaged. This was not an isolated incident. It was not bad luck, and it was not the crew's fault. What followed that attack, and hundreds of others like it across the Pacific in 1941, 1942, and well into 1943, is one of the most disturbing stories in American military history. Not because of what the enemy did, because of what the United States Navy did to its own men. A weapon that did not work. Proof that it did not work, presented repeatedly and clearly by experienced officers who staked their professional reputations on what they were saying, and a bureaucracy that chose, for more than 2 years, to protect its own reputation rather than fix the problem. Sailors died, submarines were lost, targets that should have been burning and sinking sailed on undamaged and continued delivering war materials to an enemy that was killing American soldiers on 100 different islands. And the men who tried to say something out loud were told, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding, to keep their mouths shut. This is the story of the Mark 14 torpedo, the story of 3 separate engineering failures that were identified, documented, disputed, and buried. The story of the officers who refused to stay quiet and the administrators who refused to listen. And it is a story that the United States Navy spent several decades trying very hard not to tell. To understand why the torpedo scandal was possible at all, you have to understand the position American submarines were placed in from the very first hours of the war. On the morning of December the 7th, 1941, while the smoke was still rising over Pearl Harbor and the casualty figures were still being counted, the United States Navy issued a single order to its submarine fleet: unrestricted submarine warfare. Every Japanese vessel was now a legitimate target. Every ship, every convoy, every tanker and transport and warship and supply tender. The submarines were to cut Japan's supply lines. They were to sink everything they could reach, and they were to do it relentlessly. It was an enormous strategic assignment, and it was based on a sound strategic insight. Japan was an island nation entirely dependent on sea lanes to supply its war machine. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, iron ore and bauxite from across the Pacific, rubber from Malaya, rice from across Southeast Asia, troops moving by transport to garrisons on 100 different islands. Every one of those convoys moved by ship. If American submarines could strangle those lanes the way German U-boats were strangling Britain in the Atlantic, the Japanese war economy would begin to collapse within years. The submarine force understood exactly what was being asked of them. They had trained for this. They went to sea with confidence in their mission, confidence in their training, and confidence in their weapons. That last confidence was misplaced, and the people responsible for the weapon knew it, or should have. The weapon they carried into battle was called the Mark 14. It was the Navy's standard fleet submarine torpedo, 21 feet long, weighing over 3,000 pounds, fully armed, driven by a steam turbine powered by a mixture of alcohol and compressed air, to a top speed of roughly 46 knots. Its operational range at high speed was 4,500 yards, well over 2 miles. At the nose sat a contact exploder designated the Mark 6, which was designed to detonate the warhead on impact with a ship's hull. The Bureau of Ordnance, the division of the Navy responsible for weapons design and procurement, had spent years developing both the torpedo and the exploder. They were confident in the design. They were so confident, in fact, that they had never conducted a full live fire test of the weapon against an actual target under realistic combat conditions. Live torpedoes cost roughly $10,000 each in 1941 money. The Bureau considered the expense unjustifiable for what they regarded as a proven design. The Mark 14 went to war untested. That decision would cost something considerably more than $10,000 per torpedo. The patrol reports began arriving within weeks of the war's start. Submarine commanders returning from their first war patrols were logging attack after attack, where everything had gone right and nothing had happened. Correct approach angles, correct firing solutions, visual confirmation that the torpedo had tracked straight to the target, and Japanese ships sailing away undamaged. The commanders wrote their reports with increasing frustration and increasing precision. They were not guessing. They were experienced naval officers who had spent years studying torpedo attack doctrine, and they were describing failures in clinical, methodical detail because they understood that the paperwork would determine whether anything changed. Some of them ran the mathematics obsessively after returning to port, checking and rechecking their firing solutions, looking for errors they could not find. Others began experimenting in the field, adjusting depth settings, varying approach angles, altering the speed settings on the torpedoes themselves, trying anything to make the weapon perform the way it was supposed to. A few commanders developed unofficial workarounds that they shared between themselves on the docks at Pearl Harbor, speaking quietly so that none of this reached the wrong ears. The Bureau of Ordnance's response to the patrol reports was consistent, authoritative, and wrong. The torpedoes were fine. The problem was the submarine commanders. They were missing their targets due to errors in attack technique. Their depth calculations were inaccurate. Their approach angles were imprecise. The Bureau's engineers had designed and tested the Mark 14. The Mark 14 worked, and if results in the field suggested otherwise, that was a reflection of operator error, not equipment failure. The Bureau's position was not stated tentatively or with any acknowledgement that the field reports might deserve serious investigation. It was stated as fact, from authority, and it was not open to discussion. Pause and think about what that actually means. Men who had successfully navigated enemy-patrolled waters, who had evaded escorts and made approach runs under conditions of genuine danger, who had trained for years for exactly this task, were being told by administrators who had never been aboard a fleet submarine on a war patrol that they simply did not know how to do their jobs. The commanders did not accept this quietly. They could not afford to. Every patrol they ran with defective weapons was a patrol where their crew was exposed to depth charge attack for attacks that achieved nothing. Every miss that should have been a hit was another transport delivering soldiers, another tanker delivering oil, another cargo ship delivering steel to a Japanese war economy that was killing American men on Guadalcanal and New Guinea, and a dozen other places the newspapers were just beginning to name. The skipper of the USS Skipjack filed a patrol report in 1942, describing 11 separate attack runs in which his torpedoes had either missed clean or struck ships and failed to detonate. 11 runs. He did not mince his words. He stated plainly that his weapon was defective and that the failures followed a pattern consistent with mechanical fault rather than operator error. His report was reviewed by the Bureau of Ordnance and filed. Nothing changed. Commander Tyrell Jacobs of the USS Sargo had a similarly maddening experience in the early months of the war. He fired 13 torpedoes in a series of attacks and achieved 0 confirmed sinkings. He returned to port and told his superiors flatly that the weapon did not function. He was told that his attack data would be reviewed. It was reviewed. He was found to have made errors in targeting. He disputed this finding for the remainder of his command. He was not vindicated during his time in service. But the event that finally forced the Navy to act, or at least to begin acting on the first of 3 separate problems, came not from a patrol report, but from a direct test conducted outside the Bureau of Ordnance's oversight entirely. Admiral Charles Lockwood had taken command of submarines in the Southwest Pacific in early 1942, and he had been listening to his submarine commanders rather than dismissing them. Lockwood was not a man who reached conclusions quickly or carelessly. He had spent his entire career in submarines. He understood what the patrol reports were describing because he understood the mathematics of a torpedo attack, and the mathematics told him what the Bureau of Ordnance was refusing to accept. There were too many failures. The pattern was too consistent. Something was wrong with the weapon. In the summer of 1942, Lockwood authorized an unofficial test. A net was stretched across a bay in Western Australia at a measured depth. A submarine fired a torpedo set for 10 feet. The depth required to strike a ship beneath its waterline and cause maximum damage. The torpedo passed through the net. Lockwood's team measured where the hole was. The torpedo had passed through at 21 feet. A torpedo set for 10 feet was running at 21 feet. He ran the test again. Same result. He ran it several more times with different depth settings. The torpedo consistently ran 11 feet deeper than the setting indicated. The physics of this, once someone bothered to examine it, were straightforward. The depth mechanism on the Mark 14 used water pressure to maintain its set depth. The mechanism had been calibrated using the Torpedo's exercise head, the dummy warhead used during peacetime training runs. The exercise head was lighter than the live warhead by several hundred pounds. With the heavier live warhead installed, the Torpedo's nose rode lower in the water, and the depth mechanism compensated by driving the torpedo deeper than commanded. Every Mark 14 ever fired in combat with a live warhead had run deep, everyone, from the first day of the war. When Lockwood forwarded his test results to the Bureau of Ordnance, the Bureau disputed the methodology. They stated that a net test was not an acceptable evaluation standard. They expressed continued confidence in the Mark 14's depth performance. They recommended that Lockwood conduct further evaluation using Bureau-approved methods. Lockwood did not wait. He modified the depth mechanisms on his available torpedoes using the test data he had, and he sent his submarines back to sea. The results improved somewhat. Not dramatically, but enough to confirm that the depth problem was real and that fixing it made a difference. The Bureau eventually acknowledged the depth flaw in late 1942 and issued a correction. It had taken the better part of a year from the first credible field reports to official acknowledgement of something that could have been discovered with a single properly conducted pre-war test. That was problem number one. There were two more, and they were worse. The second problem was the magnetic influence exploder built into the Mark 6. The concept behind it was genuinely clever. Instead of detonating on contact with a ship's side, where the armor belt was thickest, the magnetic exploder was designed to sense the change in the Earth's magnetic field caused by a large steel vessel and detonate the warhead beneath the ship's keel, where the hull was thinnest and where the upward force of an explosion would break the ship's back rather than simply punch a hole in her side. In theory, one torpedo with a functioning magnetic exploder could sink a ship that might survive 3 or 4 contact detonations. The problem was that the magnetic exploder had been considered so operationally sensitive, it would tell the enemy that the Americans could detect magnetic fields, which had implications for minesweeping and harbor defense. That it had been classified at a level that prevented proper field testing before the war. The Navy had run laboratory tests. It had run theoretical simulations. The engineers at Newport Torpedo Station were confident in the design, but nobody had actually fired a live torpedo with a live magnetic exploder at a real ship in realistic conditions before December of 1941. In combat, the magnetic exploder turned out to be unreliable in ways the laboratory tests had not predicted. It triggered prematurely in the magnetic anomalies around shallow harbors. It triggered on the magnetic fields of the firing submarine itself in certain conditions. It triggered in open water with no target present, producing detonations that looked and sounded exactly like hits but destroyed nothing. And in equatorial waters, where the Earth's magnetic field was weaker than at the latitudes where the exploder had been calibrated, it sometimes failed to trigger at all. Submarine commanders were watching their torpedoes detonate in open water, filing reports describing the problem in precise detail, and being told that the magnetic exploder was functioning correctly. Lockwood eventually ordered his commanders to disable the magnetic feature and rely solely on contact detonation. He issued this order on his own authority, without Bureau of Ordnance approval, because he had run out of patience for the process that was supposed to govern these decisions. The Bureau protested. Lockwood's submarines started achieving more hits, which brought everyone finally to the third problem. And this one was perhaps the most extraordinary failure of the entire scandal. When a Mark 14 torpedo struck a ship's hull at a perpendicular angle, a direct hit at 90 degrees, the ideal shot, the one every attack approach was designed to achieve, the contact exploder failed to fire. Not sometimes, consistently. The harder the hit, the more likely the dud. The engineering explanation for this requires a moment to follow, but it is worth following because the failure mode is so specific that it reveals exactly how thoroughly the Bureau had avoided testing its own weapon. The Mark 6 contact exploder fired when an impact drove a firing pin forward into a primer. The firing pin was mounted in a guide and was supposed to travel a precise distance before striking the primer and initiating the detonation sequence. At the impact velocities produced by a glancing blow, a torpedo striking at an angle rather than straight on. This worked. At the impact velocities produced by a direct perpendicular hit on a steel hull, the deceleration was so sudden and so violent that the firing pin guide crumpled before the pin completed its travel. The components collapsed against each other. The pin never reached the primer, and the torpedo, having struck its target perfectly, simply bounced off. The perfect shot produced a perfect failure. The Bureau of Ordnance had not tested the exploder at the impact velocities associated with a direct hit on a steel plate. They had tested it at lower velocities. The glancing blow test had passed. The direct hit scenario, the scenario every submarine commander spent his career training to achieve, had apparently never been evaluated. Commander Daspit brought the proof home. In July of 1943, Creed Haskett Daspit was commanding the USS Tinosa when he made contact with the Japanese whale factory ship Tonan Maru III. It was one of the largest vessels in the Japanese merchant fleet, displacing nearly 19,000 tons, and it was sitting stopped in the water with a steering casualty, immobile, enormous, and completely unable to evade. Daspit fired 15 torpedoes. He heard impact after impact. He watched through the periscope. The Tonan Maru III did not sink. She did not even list significantly. 15 hits, 15 duds. Daspit had one torpedo remaining. He made a decision that required a level of professional discipline that is difficult to fully appreciate. He did not fire it. He brought it home all the way back to Pearl Harbor, and he walked into Admiral Lockwood's office and placed it on the desk and said, "Find out what is wrong with this." Lockwood's engineers disassembled the Mark VI exploder from Daspit's torpedo and ran drop tests, essentially dropping a weighted firing pin assembly from measured heights onto a steel plate to simulate the impact forces of a torpedo strike. At low drop heights, simulating a glancing blow, the pin functioned. At high drop heights, simulating a direct perpendicular impact, the guide crumpled and the pin stopped short. The failure mode was visible. It was measurable. It was completely unambiguous. The Bureau of Ordnance, when presented with this test data, disputed the methodology. They stated that the drop tests did not accurately replicate combat conditions. They expressed confidence in the Mark VI design. They proposed additional evaluation. Lockwood's engineers redesigned the firing pin assembly in the field at Pearl Harbor. They machined lighter components from stronger materials, reconfiguring the geometry of the guide so that it could survive the impact forces that the Bureau had apparently never tested against. The modification was completed and distributed to the fleet by late 1943, 2 full years after the war began. Now let me put you somewhere specific. It is March of 1943. You are a torpedo man second class aboard a fleet submarine running at periscope depth in the Celebes Sea. You have been at sea for 27 days. Your boat has made 6 approach runs. You have heard 5 impacts. You have been depth charged 3 times. Your captain came back from the last patrol conference at Pearl Harbor visibly angry, and he has not explained why to the crew, but you have heard him and the executive officer talking in lowered voices about something called the Bureau, and the word they use most often when they think no one else can hear them rhymes with something unprintable. Tonight there is a contact, a convoy, 3 cargo ships and 2 escorts. Your captain sets up on the largest of the 3. The approach takes 2 hours. The solution is clean. At 500 yards, he fires 4 torpedoes, spread to bracket the target. You hear 4 separate impacts through the hull. The sound of a torpedo hitting steel is something you cannot mistake for anything else. 4 impacts. The sonar operator tells you the target is still making way. Your captain says nothing for a long moment. Then he orders the boat to go deep, and the escorts are already turning towards you, and the depth charges start, and you run, and you survive, and you go home. And the convoy delivers its cargo to Rabaul. The official accounting of what the torpedo failures cost is difficult to state precisely because the Navy's own records of specific failure incidents are incomplete, and because cross-referencing patrol reports against Japanese shipping records is an imperfect science. But the historians who have done this work most carefully have reached conclusions that are difficult to argue with. In the first 20 months of the Pacific War, American submarines achieved roughly 1/3 of the sinkings they should have achieved with functional weapons. The ships that were not sunk kept moving. They kept delivering aviation fuel and ammunition, and soldiers to places where American men later had to go and fight. And there is the matter of the submarines themselves. 52 American submarines were lost in the Second World War. 52 boats. Each one that went to sea with defective weapons was a boat that spent longer on patrol than it should have, pressed into closer attack ranges to compensate for weapons that were failing at standard distance, exposed to counterattack for attacks that achieved nothing, using up its patrol endurance on runs that produced no results. The specific contribution of the torpedo failures to those 52 losses cannot be calculated precisely. The Navy did not attempt to calculate it officially, which is itself a kind of answer. The Bureau of Ordnance did not face a formal inquiry during the war. None of its senior engineers were relieved of their positions over the torpedo scandal. The official Navy history of the Bureau, produced after the war ended, described the torpedo deficiencies as technical problems that were identified and corrected through the normal process of wartime weapons development, language that implies routine engineering refinement rather than a 2-year institutional failure that men paid for with their lives. Charles Lockwood was promoted to Vice Admiral and received recognition for his leadership of the Pacific Submarine Campaign, which ultimately became one of the most effective submarine operations in the history of naval warfare after the weapons were fixed. He was generous in his post-war writing about the men who served under him. He was less generous about the Bureau of Ordnance, and he did not hide what he thought had happened. His memoir, published in 1954, described the torpedo scandal with a clarity that the official histories avoided. He called it exactly what it was. There is a man named Ralph Christie who commanded submarines in the Southwest Pacific and who believed in the magnetic exploder longer than the evidence justified. He continued ordering its use after Lockwood had banned it in his own area of command, and the debate between the two admirals over the exploder, conducted through official channels while submarines were at sea, is one of the stranger subplots of the whole affair. Christie was eventually moved to a different command. He remained convinced for years that the magnetic exploder's problems were operational rather than fundamental. He may have been the last person in the Navy who believed that. And there are the engineers at Newport Torpedo Station who designed the Mark VI exploder and who certified it as combat-ready based on incomplete testing. Some of them spent the rest of their careers inside the Navy's weapons establishment. The internal memos they wrote, the test data they chose to compile, and the test scenarios they chose not to run, the certifications they signed, all of it is in the archives. Researchers have read it. The conclusions it supports are not comfortable reading if you are inclined to give institutions the benefit of the doubt. The last effective Mark XIV was pulled from service in the autumn of 1943. By that point, the American submarine force had spent nearly 2 full years fighting on 2 fronts simultaneously, one against the Imperial Japanese Navy and one against their own Bureau of Ordnance. The Second War required more patience, more documentation, more careful accumulation of evidence, and more willingness to be told they were wrong by people who had never been where they had been than the first. They won both wars. The Pacific Submarine Campaign ultimately sank approximately 5 million tons of Japanese shipping, destroyed over 200 warships, and contributed significantly to the collapse of Japan's ability to supply its military forces across the Pacific. It was one of the decisive campaigns of the war, and the men who fought it did so with weapons that were broken for the first 2 years of it. The ones who survived came home, and mostly did not talk about it. There were no parades specifically for the submarine force. There were no public investigations of the Bureau of Ordnance. There was a war to finish, and then there was peace to build, and the specific question of who had certified a defective weapon as ready and then refused to hear the evidence that it was failing. That question got buried under everything else that was happening. But the patrol reports are still there. The memos are still there. The drop test results are still there. And the logs of 52 submarines that never came home are still there. The next time you hear someone describe American military technology as inherently reliable, as beyond the kind of institutional failures that affect lesser organizations, as something that would never send men into combat with weapons that the designers knew were inadequate, remember this story. Not because American military engineers are uniquely prone to these failures, but because they are not immune to them. No institution is. And the cost of pretending otherwise is always paid by the people who trust the institution most. They gave their submariners defective torpedoes. They told the men complaining that the problem was them. They fixed it eventually, After 2 years and 52 lost boats and a body count that remains uncalculated to this day, and they called it the normal process of wartime weapons development.